those changes because it's very hard. I mean, you kind of, you know, the old saying, can a fish describe water? I mean, it's very hard to kind of change your present way of life because you're so in it, right? So that's why it takes a bunch of us coming together to figure it out. So Meg Wheatley, some of you probably know her too, she wrote Leadership in the New Science, Turning to One Another, a wonderful writer. She said, if we want this to happen, in other words, if we want to be able to change our present way of life really substantially, if we want our world to be different, our first act needs to be reclaiming time to think. No one will give us this time, because thinking is dangerous to the status quo. Those benefiting from the current system have no interest in new ideas. We can't expect those few who are well served by the current reality to give us time to think. If we want anything to change, we are the ones that have to reclaim time. And I just love that quote. And this is that time. We're reclaiming it until 4 o'clock today, or as long as anyone can stay. I know some people have to be early. And every minute of it is in itself a break from our present way of life. And it's looking at a different way of life. So even if you could only stay for 10 minutes, who would have had that experience? So I kind of wanted to start with that. I want to tell you a little bit about my journey into the Commons, and then talk about some framework, and then I'm going to hear from you. I got into the Commons, as Linda said, as you heard from my bio. This is not my field. I'm in fundraising. That's all I do. I'm like really a little bit of a Johnny One Note. Somebody said the other day, she goes, all your books have the same title. I said, yeah, they all say the same thing, too. You sell more books and you title them differently. But I got into fundraising years ago. I've been in fundraising for about 34 years. And I got into it years ago, and I went to California, which is where I live now. I had gone to college in Wisconsin. I went to California, and I studied to be a Methodist minister. And that's why I went. And so, and then part of, if any of you are familiar with clergy training, part of it is you have to do these field placements, and people usually do their field placement in a church. But I went to this very liberal seminary, so I was allowed to do mine at a secular organization, and I did it at a shelter for battered women. The very first shelter to open in the state of California was called La Casa de los Padres, and it still serves the county of San Francisco. And when it opened in 1976, it was the 5th actual shelter to open in the United States. So this is, if you imagine now there's 750 shelters, okay? Then there were 5 shelters and about half a dozen programs for battered, maybe a dozen programs for battered women. In fact, we call it battered women now, we call it domestic violence, because we have a broader understanding of the nature of that problem. But so when I was first in it, no one was talking about domestic violence. No one would acknowledge the extent of it. And of course, no one was paying to solve it, because nobody thought it was a problem. So I was drafted onto the fundraising committee to raise money from churches and synagogues. And I knew nothing about that, but I could recognize a church from the outside, so that's... That's a great thing about fundraising, is all you have to know is one unimportant fact to become the chair of the committee. So anyway, so I started doing that, going around to these churches and these synagogues and asking for money. And I'm really grateful that that was my start in fundraising, because they were actually relatively easy to get money from. And I think partly, to be truthful, and I say this as a person of faith, so I'm not trying to insult that institution. I think because they knew the extent of this problem more than any other institution. They knew the extent of it, and having done nothing about it for upwards of 5,000 years, they decided to get with the program. So it was a great place to begin fundraising. And in the course of that, I learned a lot of stuff about fundraising. And one of the things I mainly learned is that all organizations really do rise and fall on their ability to get money. So I realized that for me, I could do fundraising. I didn't find it that hard, and so I went into it, and I've been in it ever since. And mostly I focus on grassroots fundraising, because mostly I work with grassroots social justice groups. And so for many, many years, life goes on, and I publish stuff, and I never published anything original. Nothing I'm telling you today is original. Everything I kind of got from the Commons, from people told me, and I just tried to write it down. You know, there's this huge oral tradition about fundraising. People know how to raise money. All the countries that I've been to, people know how to raise money. But they never think they do. They think, oh, I don't know, because if I really knew fundraising, I would know how to get money from, you know, Bill Gates, or I would know how to get money from the government. But I'm like, no, you know. Okay, but they don't claim that as knowledge. So all I did was I said, that's knowledge, let's write it down. Because sometimes when things are written down, they look more knowledgeable than when they're just kind of out there. So that's what I did. So then people would every so often say to me, you know, really appropriate, they would say, well, do you have any proof that what you're saying works? And, you know, and I could say, yes, no, this group did it, and it works, and this group did it, and it works. And people, I do know if it works here in Detroit, you know if it works in Selma, Alabama, you know if it works amongst this population, that population. And I had, and not just me, but other people doing grassroots fundraising, we had this, you know, 3 or 4 dozen kind of our poster children groups. You know, we'd say, you know, this group. Well, those groups, starting about 10 years ago, 10, 12 years ago, those groups, so these are my best groups that do everything as best they can, which is not most groups. I mean, most groups aren't able to do that, right? My best groups start coming to me, and I start hearing from other colleagues that this is happening to them, that the best groups are coming and saying, we're not able to raise the money we were able to raise before. What's the problem? So we look, well, it's board, or you have a new director, what's the problem? Because, you know, our first instinct is always, it must be your fault. But very quickly, it became very clear that the problem was not in these groups. They were doing everything perfectly well. The problem was that the government had so downsized, starting with Reagan, with the tax cuts that started under Reagan, continuing under Bush, continuing under Clinton. Okay? This is a bipartisan thing. Shrinking government services, shrinking the very nature of what we thought was the government's job. Okay? Very different. Look how we're responding to this economic meltdown compared to how Roosevelt was able to respond to the Great Depression. I mean, really, Obama has far less latitude than Roosevelt did. You know, when you really think about this health system that he just tried to create, which is, as Hope pointed out, it is still very private. Okay, imagine trying to create Social Security now. Well, you couldn't. It wouldn't happen. This is an enormous sea change from history. And just a kind of a little tangential thing is sort of to think that Eisenhower, okay, that great radical, President Eisenhower, who was a Republican, for those of you who may be too young to remember, Eisenhower, the top tax bracket under Eisenhower was 90%. Okay? But Eisenhower believed that wealthy people, the top bracket of people, should pay 90% of their income in the top 90% of their, you know, when they got to that bracket, 90% of it should be taxed. Okay? You could never bring that back now. Now, if you try to get up to 40%, people have a meltdown. They fight at 25. Yes, they fight at 25. So it's an amazing shift. And what's happened because of that, so just to kind of get to the story, is that all these public sector groups started to be in the private sector. And I remember distinctly this day in Monterey, California, a very beautiful town on the coast of California. Did a big workshop, 70 people there. Half of them were public school teachers and public school principals. One of them was from the city of Stockton, which is a fairly big-sized city in California, who was working as the development director for the city of Stockton to raise money from corporations for the city of Stockton. And I was like, what have I entered the twilight zone? This is not making sense. And there are in California, and I think Michigan is not far behind in this, there are in California now no truly public schools. Every public school, in order for it to have an art program, a library, a music program, increasingly a sports program, the parents have to raise money. I'm working with a PTA in a fairly poor school just a little bit north of me, school system a little bit north of me. That PTA, those parents work all the time. They raise about $230,000 a year. I mean, this is ridiculous. And it really means that the gap between good public schools in affluent communities becomes more and more vast because it's simply not possible for many parents to put the time in, or even if they were able to put the time in, their communities don't have the money. So for example, the thing that just breaks my heart is an organization in California called Californians for Justice, which teaches young high school students how to do community organizing. They go into high schools and they say, okay, what would you like to organize around? And historically, the students have said, well, we want an art program, or we want a better basketball court, or something like that. And they do this organizing, and they learn how to do it. So these students were presenting their victory. I went to their victory celebration, and they got up, and they were very proud. And what was really heartbreaking is they have been in this system so long, they couldn't even see how extraordinary this was. The thing that they organized around was toilets that flush. That's what they wanted. And stalls that have doors on them. And I just thought, and they were like really pleased, they got that, they won. but that they don't even imagine that that is like something that, that in the United States of America, no student should have to organize, should learn organizing on that, is extraordinary. So all these public sector groups,